DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
A scrap of Victorian silk, one dark stain, 137 years old. A molecular biologist in Liverpool cuts into it, and the DNA that comes out does something nobody expected. It matches a woman alive today, whose 3 times great-grandmother was murdered in Whitechapel in 1888. Underneath that, the team says, is a second profile, the man who killed her, and it points to a name the police wrote down at the time and never charged. That should have ended the mystery. Instead, it turned, and the turn came from the last place anyone was watching. The Phantom Century.
The savagery of Jack the Ripper's crimes terrorized the residents of London. No one was even charged, although the police have had their suspicions. Now, more than a century later, modern technology may have finally unmasked the elusive killer.
To understand why any of this lands like a hammer blow, you have to understand the size of the legend it walked into. For more than a century, Jack the Ripper was never really treated as a man at all. He was a ghost story, stitched together out of fog and gaslight, belonging less to the world of criminal records than to the world of campfire tales. Think about what that darkness looked like. Autumn, 1888. The East End of London, a district called Whitechapel, wrapped in the thick yellow smog Londoners called a pea souper. Fog so dense with coal smoke that a man could stand 3 feet from you and be nothing more than a smudge. Narrow courts and blind alleys branching off streets that branched off other streets. And somewhere inside that maze, a killer was working. Not simply killing, doing something to his victims so deliberate, so anatomical, so cold, that it terrified a city of 4 million and then terrified the world.
2 British scientists are finally revealing the DNA evidence they say helped solve one of history's biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper.
And the world responded the way it always does, to horror it cannot explain. It reached for a grand story, a brilliant surgeon, given how neatly he seemed to cut, an aristocrat slumming in the gutters for sport. Because if he was ordinary, if he was some anonymous nobody out of the poorest streets in Britain, then the horror had no meaning. It was just random, and random is unbearable. So the legends bloomed. The most durable insisted the murders were a royal cover-up, a grandson of Queen Victoria, a secret child, a circle of Freemasons silencing every woman who knew. Almost certainly fiction, but it tells you what the public wanted the Ripper to be: powerful, connected, important, and Scotland Yard had nothing to set against it. Hundreds of suspects, thousands of letters, zero proof. No fingerprinting worth the name, no way to test a bloodstain and learn anything beyond the fact that it was blood, a whistle, a wooden truncheon, 2 eyes. So the case slid out of the world of law and into the world of myth. Every generation produced a new book, a new suspect, a new confident author swearing that this time it was the doctor, the painter, the prince, the poet, and every generation the phantom slipped away again. But here is the thing about phantoms. They leave nothing behind. And the entire reason this case cracked open is that the Whitechapel killer, on one terrible night, may have left something behind after all. The Forgotten Cloth.
This silk shawl is believed to be the last piece of physical evidence left from his killing spree more than 130 years ago.
It comes down to a single object, one stained, tattered, ordinary-looking piece of cloth, a silk shawl. To most people who ever laid eyes on it, it looked like junk, faded, discolored, marked with old brown stains that could have been anything. But it carried a claim that, if true, made it one of the most valuable objects on the planet, because according to the story handed down with it, the shawl was there. On the night of the 30th of September, 1888, beside the body of the Ripper's 4th victim, a woman named Catherine Eddowes, and it is worth stopping on her, because everything that follows turns her into evidence. And she was not evidence. She was 46 years old. She had pawned a pair of boots that week to scrape together the price of a bed. She was picked up drunk that evening, held in a cell until she had sobered enough to walk, and released into the dark a little after 1 in the morning. Under an hour later, a constable found her in the corner of Mitre Square. That is the woman the silk is supposed to have touched. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women, and it is the 4th of them this cloth is supposed to have lain beside. The provenance was as strange as everything else in this case. The story attached to it said it was picked up that night by a police officer at the scene, a sergeant named Amos Simpson, For reasons nobody has ever explained, he took the cloth home instead of logging it as evidence. Perhaps he thought his wife would like the silk. Perhaps he simply pocketed a curiosity, the way people did in an age before sealed bags and evidence chains. Whatever the reason, the shawl never entered any official record. It stayed in his family, folded away, passed down the generations like an heirloom nobody quite wanted and nobody quite dared throw out. And for the skeptics, that was exactly the problem. A piece of evidence that appears in no police report, that vanishes from history the moment it supposedly leaves the crime scene, has a hole in the middle of it. So, for over a century, serious historians looked at the shawl and shrugged. It was, in their view, Ripper-tat, one item in an endless flood of fakes and wishful relics that had attached themselves to this case like barnacles. Letters supposedly written by the killer, knives supposedly used by him. In a mystery this hungry, anyone could claim anything. And plenty did. The shawl sat in the reject pile of history, dismissed by the very experts who might have cared most about it. But not everyone was willing to let it go, and the answer it eventually gave up would not sit easily with the very discipline that produced it. That part comes later. The obsessive buyer.
Not that I know of. There is no other evidence. There's no physical evidence, which is why it's always remained a mystery.
In 2007, the shawl came up for auction, and a man walked into that room who was about to stake everything he had on the belief that it was real. His name was Russell Edwards. He was not a detective, and he was not a scientist. He was an author and a self-described amateur sleuth, one of the countless people this case has swallowed whole. The difference was that Edwards had the money, the obsession, and the nerve to do something about it. Where everyone else saw junk, he saw the one thing the Phantom might have left behind. He bought it. And then he did something 120 years of investigators before him could never have imagined. He decided to make it talk. The Victorian police could stand over that cloth and see only fabric and dried blood. Edwards was living in a different world, one where a single cell could be unspooled and read like a signature. What he needed was somebody who could actually do it, because this was never going to be an ordinary test. It was going to be one of the hardest jobs in forensic biology. So he went looking, and he found Dr. Jari-Lu Helanen, a Finnish molecular biologist based at Liverpool John Moores University, a specialist whose entire career revolved around one impossibly delicate problem. How do you recover genetic material from samples that are old, degraded, ruined, and by every reasonable standard dead? This is the kind of scientist who takes something the rest of us would bin and coaxes a whisper out of it. And the odds were terrible. That piece of silk was over 125 years old. It had spent that century and a quarter nowhere near a climate-controlled vault. Folded in drawers, stuffed in boxes, handled by curious relatives, exposed to damp air and sunlight and dust and the oils of countless human hands. DNA is a fragile molecule. Time breaks it apart, moisture breaks it apart, sunlight breaks it apart. Handling smears it and buries it under the traces of everyone who ever touched the cloth. Getting a clean, readable profile off this object was not difficult. It was closer to a miracle. If you are finding this as strange as I do me a favor and subscribe before we go further, because the next part is where this stops being a story about a shawl and starts being a story about a name. Why mitochondria matter. There was one narrow door left open, and Lu Helanen knew where to look. He did not go after the fibers. He went after the stains. At the bench, under the lamp, with the silk held flat, he worked only the darkest brown marks, lifting sections so small they were barely there. Those marks, the ones that made everyone else dismiss the thing as garbage, were, if the story was true, the residue of the crime itself. And residue can shelter genetic material far longer than open cloth ever could. And this is where the science gets clever. What he was chasing was not the standard DNA most people picture, the double helix inside the nucleus of a cell. That kind is powerful. It is also scarce and fragile, and in a sample this abused, most of it would be long gone. Instead, the work went after something tougher and far more abundant: mitochondrial DNA. Every cell in your body contains tiny structures called mitochondria, the power plants that keep the cell running, and each carries its own small loop of DNA. There are hundreds, sometimes thousands, in a single cell. In a degraded sample, that abundance is everything. It is the difference between hunting for 1 grain of sand and hunting for 1,000 copies of it. But the part that turns this molecule into a time machine is how it is inherited. Unlike the DNA in your nucleus, a shuffled mix of your mother and your father, Mitochondrial DNA comes down to you from one source only, your mother, and her mother before her, back and back in an unbroken female line. A man carries his mother's mitochondrial DNA but never passes it on. Only women hand it down, which means the signature in your cells right now is, in essence, the same one carried by a woman who lived centuries ago. Nuclear DNA degrades fast and reshuffles wildly from parent to child. Mitochondrial DNA holds its shape down a maternal line, long enough that a sample taken today can be laid beside one from the 1800s and genuinely compared. That was the only bridge that could reach the far shore. Hold on to that word, lineage. Later, it becomes the biggest problem with everything that follows. Finding the victim. So, the plan took shape. If they could pull mitochondrial DNA off the shawl, they needed something to compare it against. A living person whose own maternal line ran back unbroken to somebody present in Mitre Square that night. And the first person they needed to find was not a suspect at all. It was the victim. Because before you can prove who committed a crime, you have to prove the object in your hands was ever at the scene of it. If the shawl was a fake, a length of Victorian silk somebody had dressed up with old stains to fool collectors, then any DNA on it would mean precisely nothing. Authenticity had to come first. So the search began for a descendant of Catherine Eddowes, not just any relative. The line had to run through women only, mother to daughter, right down to somebody alive today. It is a peculiar kind of detective work, not dark alleys, dusty parish registers, and census returns, following the female line past 2 world wars and the demolition of the old East End slums into the modern age. And eventually, they found her. A woman named Karen Miller, Catherine Eddowes' 3 times great-granddaughter, in the direct maternal line. She was living an ordinary modern life, entirely unaware that the blood in her veins carried a fingerprint reaching back to the age of gaslight and horse-drawn cabs. She gave a sample, a simple cheek swab, over in seconds, a link across more than a century. Then, it was laid beside the profile, coaxed out of the stain in the silk. Picture the tension in that room. Years of work, a reputation staked on a gamble everybody else had called foolish. All of it coming down to whether 2 sequences of genetic code, separated by 5 generations and 120-odd years, would line up. And according to Lou Halanen, they did. He later told the Liverpool Echo that the first test returned a match of 99.2%, and that the complementary strand was a full match. Sit with what that meant, because this was the finding that changed the picture. It meant the shawl was not a fake. That scrap of tattered silk, dismissed for a century as sentimental junk, had been telling the truth the whole time. It had been there. It had lain in that dim square in the small hours and drunk up the blood of a woman who minutes earlier had been alive and breathing and hoping to earn the price of a bed. For Edwards, that alone would have been vindication. But authenticity was only ever the doorway, because if that cloth had genuinely been at the scene, it might carry more than the victim. The second stain. It might carry something left behind by the man who spilled her blood. And this is where the story takes its darkest and most disputed turn. When the shawl was examined more closely, the team reported finding, mixed in among the traces of the victim, other biological material, not blood. That part of the work was handled by Dr. David Miller of the University of Leeds, a specialist in human reproduction. He reported identifying cells consistent with seminal fluid, still present in the fabric after well over a century. That single detail reframed everything the cloth might be. It suggested the man who attacked Catherine Eddowes had not simply killed her and vanished into the fog, but had left a piece of himself behind on the very fabric that fell against her body. If that were true, the shawl was no longer only a relic of the victim. It was, the team says, a carrier of the perpetrator's own biology, trapped in silk, waiting through the reigns of 7 monarchs for somebody with the tools to read it. So the team isolated that second signature, the trace they believed belonged to the man himself, and extracted its mitochondrial DNA. Now they had a profile, not a name. Mitochondrial DNA cannot spell out a name or conjure a face. What it gives you is a signature, a specific sequence, a marker left by whoever had raged in that dark square. The paper went further still. From material recovered on the shawl, the researchers reported a phenotype prediction, an attempt to describe physical appearance from genetic markers, brown hair, brown eyes, which, they noted, matched the one contemporary witness description of a man seen with a victim that was generally regarded as reliable. But a description is not an identification. What they needed was somebody to compare the profile against, not a suspect dredged out of the fog of 100 amateur theories. A man whose name was already sitting there, written into the original police files by the officers who hunted the Ripper while the bodies were still warm. Because here is what the public never fully appreciated. Obsessed as they were with royal conspiracies and mad surgeons and secret societies, the detectives of 1888, for all their limitations, were not fools. They had walked those streets, they had knocked on those doors, and quietly, away from the newspapers and the panic, they had drawn up their own private list of the men they truly suspected. One name sat near the very top of it. It was not the name anybody wanted, and that is exactly why it took so long for anyone to listen. The name itself. A name that meant nothing to the wider world. A name that would never sell a lurid paperback or inspire a film. Genealogists went hunting through that man's family, once more along the maternal line. They found a female line descendant of the suspect's family, a woman not publicly identified at the time, living quietly, entirely unaware that her ancestry might close the most infamous case in criminal history. She gave a swab. It went back to the laboratory to be run against the profile the team believed the killer had left in the silk. The sequences were laid side by side. And once again, the researchers reported the same result, a match. After 137 years, the science, they said, pointed to a single man, and his name was Aaron Kosminski. If that name lands with a dull thud rather than a thunderclap, that is precisely the point. Kosminski does not fit the story the world spent a century telling itself. He was not a duke in disguise or a genius anatomist stalking the fog for sport. He was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant who cut hair for a living in the crowded, filthy streets of Whitechapel. A barber, an ordinary working man moving through the exact neighborhood where the bodies were being found. He was not a phantom who materialized from the mist and dissolved back into legend. He was a local. He lived among the victims and walked the same alleys, and the police knew precisely who he was. His life had been marked by suffering long before those autumn nights. Born in Clodowa in September 1865, he came to London's East End in the early 1880s with his brother, among thousands of Jewish families fleeing the pogroms tearing through communities across the Russian Empire. He arrived looking for safety and found grinding poverty and worsening illness instead. By 1889, he was destitute enough to end up in the workhouse. By all accounts, he was profoundly mentally unwell, tormented by what modern specialists reading the asylum records believe was paranoid schizophrenia. He was described as plagued by voices no one else could hear, and this is the detail the old police files return to again and again: a deep and violent hatred of women. That is not a diagnosis invented for a video. That is what the men who watched him wrote down at the time. What Scotland Yard knew. Which brings us to the quiet scandal buried inside all of this. While the newspapers screamed and the theories multiplied, the senior officers were building their own shortlist in private. Melville McNagnon, then Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, set his suspicions down in an internal memorandum in 1894. He named Kosminski as one of 3 men he considered more likely than the suspect the press had fixed on, describing a homicidal tendency and a hatred of women. But the sharper detail came from higher still. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the officer who oversaw the entire investigation, went to his grave carrying it. Years after retiring, he was reading his old superior's memoirs, and there, in the margin beside the passage about the case, he scribbled a note never meant for anybody else to see. He wrote, in effect, that the suspect was Kosminski. History was hiding in a pencil scrawl in the margin of a book, and the timeline does close around the man. He lived in the beating heart of the murder district and was known to be dangerous. In February 1891, his family, unable to control or protect him any longer, had him committed. He went first to Colney Hatch Asylum and later to Leavesden and never came out. Now, here is where the version you have probably heard goes wrong, and it matters. You will hear that the murders stopped the moment Kosminski was locked away. That is not what happened. The last of the canonical 5 murders was in November 1888. He was committed in February 1891. A gap of more than 2 years, and any honest account of this case has to say so out loud. Swanson's note carries a similar problem. He wrote that the suspect died soon after being committed. Aaron Kosminski did not. He lived in institutions for 28 more years and died of gangrene in March 1919. 28 years, and in all that time, he was never charged with anything. You have to understand the world that made this possible. An East End packed at over 1,000 souls to the acre, where the women he killed fought every night for the price of a doss house bed. The tragedy is how much was thrown away. A bloodied piece of Eddowes' apron was found in a doorway on Goulston Street, beneath a chalked message about the Jews. Commissioner Sir Charles Warren ordered the writing scrubbed off before dawn, terrified it would ignite riots against the Jewish community. He erased one of the only fragments of physical evidence anybody ever had. In that world, the killer never needed to be a criminal mastermind. He only needed to be local, which is why, when the laboratory finally produced his name, it looked like the end of it. It was not. The people who understood the science best had only just started reading. The case against. So, is that it? Is the ghost finally unmasked as a sick, ordinary barber the police had circled all along? Not according to the people who have looked hardest at the science. Their objections fall into two piles, and both matter. The first is about what mitochondrial DNA can and cannot do. The very property that made it useful, passing down a maternal line unchanged, is exactly why it cannot identify an individual. A mitochondrial profile does not belong to a person. It belongs to a lineage. Everybody descended from the same maternal ancestor carries the same signature, and depending on the sequence, that can mean tens of thousands of living people share it. Critics argued that some of the variants reported here are common across large European populations, which would narrow the field to an enormous group rather than to one man. And it has been very difficult to check because the full sequence data was never published. The authors said they withheld it out of obligations to living relatives under data protection law. Whatever the reason, outside scientists could not independently verify the central claim. When the paper appeared in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019, that gap drew formal letters to the editor from D. Kim Rossmo of Texas State University and from Felice Bedford, and separate criticism from Walter Parson and Hansi Weisensteiner of Innsbruck Medical University, who questioned both the methods and the way the comparison had been constructed. The second pile is about the cloth, and it is worse. Amos Simpson was a real policeman, but he was an acting sergeant in N Division of the Metropolitan Police, covering Islington and out towards Cheshunt, and no surviving police order records him being drafted into the murder district. Mitre Square was not Metropolitan Police ground at all. It fell under the City of London Police, a separate force. The story needs an officer from the wrong force, miles off his patch, standing over a body that was not his to attend. And from that unrecorded moment, the cloth passed through his family, collectors, an auction house, Edwards himself, and finally a modern laboratory, touched, folded, and breathed on for over a century before anyone thought to protect it. Then there is the fabric. Textile specialists who have examined the shawl have suggested dates ranging from the early 1800s to the Edwardian period, decades after the murders, and origins anywhere across Europe. It is also fine, expensive silk. Catherine Eddowes was so poor she had pawned her boots that week. Nothing resembling this item appears in the meticulous inventory of her possessions taken after her death. Critics, including the historian Hallie Rubenhold, author of The Five, have argued that a woman in her circumstances would have pawned such a thing long before she ever wore it into Mitre Square. Set the handling aside, and there is still the innocent transfer problem. Kosminski was a barber, working in the same few streets as these women. Genetic material shared between two people who lived a short walk apart is not, on its own, evidence of murder. The order matters too. Edwards published the identification in his book, Naming Jack the Ripper, in 2014, 5 years before the underlying science reached peer review. The claim reached the public long before the method reached the people qualified to test it. None of this proves Aaron Kosminski was innocent. It is entirely possible that the police were right, and that the barber they watched and never charged did these things. But that is a very different statement from saying it has been proven, and the distance between those two statements is where this entire story now lives. The journal turns, and this is the turn almost nobody covering the headlines mentioned. In 2024, the Journal of Forensic Sciences published an expression of concern attached to the paper. It was agreed by the journal's editor-in-chief, Michael Peet, and the publisher, Wiley Periodicals, acting on behalf of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. It is worth being precise because this is easy to overstate in either direction. An expression of concern is not a retraction. The paper has not been withdrawn, and the authors have not been found to have done anything dishonest. It is a formal notice telling readers that questions have been raised about a study which the journal has not been able to resolve, and that the findings should be treated with caution. A flag planted on the record. The concerns centered on the mitochondrial DNA conclusions and on whether the evidence presented could support the identification being made from it. The authors responded to the criticisms and stood by their work. Think about the shape of that for a moment. This case has followed the same rhythm for 137 years. Somebody announces the answer, the headlines run, and then the answer quietly dissolves. What is different this time is that the dissolution happened inside the scientific record itself, in public, in the same journal that published the finding. The most rigorous test the Kosminski identification has ever faced did not come from a rival Ripper author. It came from the discipline the claim was made in. And here is what makes this moment genuinely strange. At almost exactly the point where the science was being flagged for caution, the campaign to have that same science recognized by a British court accelerated harder than it ever had before. Reopening the case. Because Russell Edwards did not stop, requests to exhume Kosminski were refused. Applications for a fresh inquest into the death of Catherine Eddowes were refused too, most recently by the then Attorney General Sir Michael Ellis, who concluded there was not sufficient new evidence to justify one. Then, in January 2025, Edwards' legal team wrote to the current Attorney General, Richard Hermer, seeking permission to petition the High Court for a fresh inquest. Under English law, that permission is the gate. Only if it is granted can a judge consider directing a new inquest, and only there could a coroner formally consider who was responsible for her death. What makes this application different is who is standing behind it. Karen Miller, the descendant whose swab authenticated the shawl in the first place, has publicly backed the call. She has argued that the name Jack the Ripper was sensationalized into a character, while the real women were forgotten. Having the man legally named, she says, would be a form of justice for the victims. And from the other side of the murder, Amanda Poulos, Kosminski's 3 times great niece, has also said she supports it. A descendant of the victim and a descendant of the accused, asking the same court for the same thing. The senior coroner for East London, Nadia Prasad, has written to Edwards' solicitor indicating she would not oppose the application and would be prepared to preside if directed to do so. But even that letter carried a caution that cuts to the heart of it. She observed that a fresh inquest would be unlikely to reach any different outcome from the original, the only genuinely new factor being the suggestion that the perpetrator might now be identified. That is the honest state of it, not a court declaring the case solved. A permission request, still sitting with the Attorney General, that has not been granted. And running underneath the legal argument is something simpler. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women who have spent 137 years as the supporting cast in somebody else's ghost story. That is what the families are actually asking to reverse. What remains open? So, where does that leave the mystery? In the strangest position it has occupied in a century. There is a name, backed by laboratory work, that its author calls conclusive, and that the journal which published it has since flagged for caution. There is a piece of cloth that might be the only physical trace of the crime ever recovered, or a length of the wrong silk with the wrong story attached. And there are lawyers in front of the Attorney General right now, trying to get an English court to say the name out loud in a way that counts. The case is not closed. It is moved, and that is more than it has done in 137 years. So I will leave it with you. Do you think the science named him and Aaron Kosminski was hiding in plain sight the whole time, watched by police who never charged him? Or do you think that shawl is too contaminated and too undocumented to trust, and the real killer is still out there in the fog? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because we are only getting started.